Hello, I'm Daniel with the Recovery Central in Washington, Indiana, and this happens to be the 29th of April of 2020, and as you all know, we've been under quarantine during this COVID-19 crisis, and so we do hope that you are all staying well, and we also hope that we're learning lessons during this time that will be useful for later times. Today I'm actually saying a little bit more about something called CRAFT, which is Community Reinforcement and Family Training. This is a model that has been around for decades. It also began as the CRA, or Community Reinforcement Approach, and the theorist and author is Robert J. Myers, who is the researcher behind CRAFT. So I would recommend that you look Dr. Myers up on the internet. Look up Community Reinforcement and Family Training. If you Google the letters CRAFT, I don't think you're going to get this model. You're going to get CRAFT, as in arts and crafts. But I definitely am not the expert on CRAFT, so you'll find a wealth of material already out there. But I do hope that you will find this instruction useful, as we are using this here at Recovery Central in Washington, Indiana. It will also help, as you're learning CRAFT, to understand something about the principles of operant conditioning, which is to look at various consequences of behaviors and ways to modify behaviors based on understanding of those consequences. But this is also a model that can be taught to lay people. It is designed to be used by lay people in their communities. You're not required to be a clinician or a scholar to use this in your hometown with families who struggle with addiction, with at least one member. Everything here that I present in this session is actually taken from the book Getting Your Loved Ones Sober by Dr. Robert Myers and Dr. Brenda Wolfe, co-author. The subtitle, or the subtitle of this book is Alternatives to Nagging, Pleading, and Threatening. Everything that is presented today in this session is taken from this book. I'll remind you of the two goals that I mentioned in the introduction to CRAFT. And these two goals are, one, to improve the quality of the family member's life, or that concerned significant other, or CSO, to improve that person's quality of life. And the second goal is to make sobriety more attractive than problematic substance use for the one who is drinking or using. And so, keeping these two goals in mind, we begin by explaining something called behavioral mapping. And this is the way CRAFT works. Behavioral mapping involves three items. One is your loved one's drinking history or use history. The second is a baseline for behavior. And the third is the action plans. This session will look at only the first two of those items. And we remind people to think, when they consider their loved one who has the substance use problem, if you have ever caught yourself saying to yourself, I knew she would do that, or there he goes again, then you already have some evidence that there are patterns to the person's substance use. And so we need to identify triggers for the behavior. We need to explain increases or decreases in the behavior, and where you, the concerned significant other, fit in, as well as identifying and locating booby traps, which are like obstacles on the road that kind of interfere with your progress in this loved one's recovery. Now, generally, behavioral mapping is your use history, the baseline for behavior, and the action plans. Specifically, a map of drinking behavior has three parts. One is describe the substance use triggers. Two, describe early signs of intoxication. And 3, identify consequences of the using behavior. Looking at the triggers of substance use. Triggers can be compared to highway signs that remind you an exit is coming. Remember, though, that an exit coming up does not mean the exit will be taken. So in the same way, a drinking trigger is still a trigger even if it does not always lead to drinking. A drinking trigger is defined as something that often leads to the use behavior, the substance use or drinking. You want to identify triggers for your loved one by trying to remember all the circumstances that often trigger that behavior. In the table on the next page is a list of common triggers for drinking behavior. Beginning with substance use triggers, these include events, moods, people, times, days, thoughts, places, or even sensory experiences like smelling a certain product. The second is to describe early signs of intoxication, and there can be a few signs that you might already know, such as slurred speech or possibly getting agitated or making a statement like, I worked all day, I deserve at least one, or other things that really give you some signs of a movement from sobriety toward intoxication. And the third part of this drinking map is identifying consequences of the using behavior, which can include things like feeling sick, missing work, struggle with raising children, a car accident, and others that I think may also be very, if not too familiar for many of us. And so, as we identify the consequences, our third item, we want to know specifically to identify a step-by-step sequence that ends with the substance use. And if we can identify that sequence, it becomes easier to find ways to begin to change that pattern. And while this can be a depressing exercise, it is critical for completing the behavioral map, which means changing the situation. So as you try to remember all the consequences of your loved one's behavior, think of both immediate and long-term problems. Be sure to include positive outcomes as well as negative. Be attentive to some role the substance use might be serving. It might even serve your own interests in some way. Does it become an excuse for you to not deal with him or her at that time? Does it keep the person dependent on you? And while there is not necessarily a positive consequence, the honest search for possibility prevents the situation from blindsiding you as you start to make changes. Remember that knowledge is power. And this work on the behavioral map is critical. Understanding the work does not guarantee you will be able to identify your loved one's triggers, signs of use, or consequences. You really need to practice. You need some experience doing it. You need to identify specifically what those items are for your loved one. And then once you know your loved one's patterns, you can begin to make changes. When you can predict what will happen at a given location, you can now choose not to go there with him or her. Instead of engaging in the same drama over and over, be aware of the triggers, the signs and consequences that are within your control. You can remove yourself from the situation. You can change what you say or how you look and what you do in the process. That brings us to this matter of getting a baseline. And in terms of baseline, this is a place from which you start. It is actually that drinker's pattern of how much and how often. And there are two reasons why it is important to establish a baseline. The first reason is to complete the behavioral map. It is to get everything you know about a loved one's drinking or using. The second reason is to help the concerned significant other recognize progress as it happens. There are also a couple of steps in getting this baseline. The first can be done by completing an exercise which involves thinking carefully in an effort to answer every question, construct a clear picture of the person's drinking, use a calendar and think back from one day to the next, and estimate the amount of use for each day. Notice the tendencies to drink more or less on weekends, as well as changes from week to week. Identify special drinking days, which could be holidays, sports events, Friday nights, or any occasion which serves as an excuse to drink without restraint. And when drinking is known to go beyond the concerned significant other's observation, instinct is also an important tool, since many problem drinkers do sneak their drinks. So your hunch is probably right. In any case, a best estimate is made, and knowing that it's not possible to monitor a person's drinking 24/7. Now here, as it is understood in craft, one serving of alcohol is identified or understood as 12 ounces of beer, 4 ounces of wine, 1 to 1 1/4 ounces of 80 proof liquor, or 1 ounce of 100 proof liquor. So this means that you're going to really examine the pattern. You want to ask yourself, how many drinks does the person usually drink on a typical Monday? Do the same for Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And you want to get a sense of how much it all amounts to. You want to compare, if you have a chance, with your estimate of that person's drinking pattern a year ago or when you first met. You want to ask if this number of servings has increased over the years. Does the number go up or down on special days? Estimate the number of hours spent each day drinking or in some drinking-related activity. How much time is spent going to a liquor store or a bar or being hungover or going to the hospital or jail or other undesired setting because of the drinking? And this all becomes part of that baseline. Secondly, you want to use a detailed picture of where you are today as knowledge to help you get to where you want to be tomorrow. And this is an exercise you might repeat periodically as you begin to bring in alternatives or new ways of responding and interacting with the loved one who has the substance use problem. So by tracking changes in the numbers, you have one way to measure the impact that your efforts are having on the substance use. At the same time, remember that even if your loved one's behavior does not improve, an improved quality of life for you is the more important measure of success for you and for those who depend on you. In the past, you have likely argued with your loved one about how much drinking is too much. Your drinker probably argued that she or he does not drink all that much. There may even have been times when you wondered which of us is crazy. And while there can be many definitions of normal drinking and problem drinking, the recommendation here is if an individual's alcohol intake is causing problems, then that person is drinking too much. And this practice of highlighting the extent of the drinking problem can be very upsetting. This may also be your first experience at really getting that baseline. You may have discovered it is worse than you realized. But remember that documenting the problem has not changed anything. It simply increases your own awareness in preparation to move forward. A complete drinking map helps you figure out how to add smooth and healthy roads along your journey. And you can now begin to do what we call redesigning the map. You redesign the map when you rearrange the way you interact with your drinker to eliminate or minimize the triggers that lead to drinking. By using the information you have gathered for this behavioral map, you begin to remap your drinker's behavior. You can stop watching your drinker go from one drinking episode to the next and create new pathways away from old drinking triggers toward non-drinking activities. We do this by examining your loved one's drinking triggers and targeting the 2 or 3 most common ones to begin working on changes. For each trigger, describe everything you know about it, the details of the trigger, the who, what, where, when, why, how, as well as every consequence of that drinking. Include your own reactions and the reactions of others. Describe the drinking pattern, how one drink might lead to the next, or the drinking becomes fast and furious. And the best way to do this is by drawing it out on paper. You might use arrows to show how one event leads to another. By mapping out the sequence that follows a trigger, you can begin to identify ways to interrupt it. By identifying your loved one's drinking triggers, signs, and consequences at baseline, you can begin to start drawing your map. You can create 2 versions of this map. One to describe the typical development of a drinking episode, and a second to describe a more desirable outcome. For now, begin planning the changes that you can make. As you increase your understanding of craft, you can design new approaches with more effective strategies. The central components of these alternatives, as we call them, are identify the triggers and the consequences of your loved one's drinking, learn to map the behavior, begin to see the big picture. You no longer need to feel victimized by events which seem beyond your control. By figuring out what triggers and maintains the events, you can change your actions which begin to change the outcome. Commit some time to mapping out the most troublesome drinking patterns and problem solve them step by step. You may also find it helpful to involve a friend, a family member, or even a therapist in helping you brainstorm, share ideas, or find enlightenment or encouragement. And so we hope as you study more and prepare more that you do find positive results in your efforts at getting your loved ones sober and understanding more about the use of craft in the family. Thank you very much.